Hello and welcome to Ex Cult Ed, the podcast where I share my experiences, thoughts and feelings after leaving the truth, otherwise known as the 2x2 way, the fellowship, the one true way. You get the picture. My hope is that in sharing this it will be cathartic for me and perhaps make you, dear listener, feel less alone if you've been through or are going through something similar. This is my story. This episode has topics of indecent and sexual assault. The thing about being in a cult is you rarely get told you have rights. After all, God is in control of everything and He's the protector, the divine judge. Anything that happens is either God's will or something He allowed to happen. The Bible even talks about turning the other cheek. So why would you ever have to stand up for yourself? I grew up very protected from the idea of sexual predators. All I knew was that we were the sheep and the world was full of ravenous wolves. What they didn't tell us was that the cult was also full of them. As a child, I didn't realize the difference between right and wrong when it came to how other people treated me. I remember my own father making comments that made me feel uncomfortable. For example, I would come out of the shower in a towel and he would wolf whistle and say, "Sexy legs." I suppose he thought he was just teasing, but I remember this making me feel very uncomfortable. However, my mother didn't say anything, so I also ignored it. My father and mother also had a big argument when I decided I didn't want him coming into the bathroom when I was showering anymore. He didn't like it because I didn't mind Mum coming in. Not that she really did, but it was her ensuite I was using. Thinking back, it's hard to understand how he thought that this was an issue that should be debated between them instead of just respecting what the younger me wanted. I also remember him touching my legs when I was young and then pretending his hand was hurt, implying that my legs were like sandpaper. One of my more traumatic memories of my father was a time when he went to the toilet and upon coming out chose not to wash his hands but come over to me at the dining table and wipe his hands on my face. When young me complained about this, he got angry. I also did not like this, but again, because Mum didn't say anything, neither did I. All I knew was that this made me feel uncomfortable. It didn't feel right, but I wasn't aware that doing something about it was even an option. I should mention here that my father was not in the cult. He had been raised in it, but he had left when I was too young to remember. I grew up in what was called a divided home. Luckily though, my father was mostly off chasing other women and rarely lived with us. However, his example and influence on my young life further served to teach me how bad the world was and how good the cult was. His attitude and my mother's peacekeeping silence also taught me that I didn't have a right to stand up for myself when I was physically uncomfortable. I was very young when I got my period, about 10 years old. It was quite a shock to me. My father was appalled that I didn't want to talk to him about it. That was another argument he and my mother had because the child was moody and didn't want to talk to him about this huge life change she was dealing with. A few days later, we went to a family gathering on my father's side, mostly with people from the cult. Imagine my horror when my aunties started giving me period-related presents and congratulating me on becoming a woman. I was completely mortified that he had told them such a personal thing about me, and that everyone there was aware of this strange turn of events that I was still coming to terms with. Again, my body and my feelings about it were of minimal importance. My first experience with indecent assault was when I was about 13 years old, and it happened at the safest place God could provide us on earth, convention. This was the time we took away from technology and the influences of the world to just be around God's people and learn about Him. It was evening and we just finished supper, the best time of day at convention, where all 400 people squeezed into tables at the dining shed and had hot drinks and cakes and biscuits before lights out. Often the young people would go for evening walks after supper, which myself and about 4 others did on this particular evening. During the walk I stopped and looked up at the night sky in amazement. I loved seeing the stars from the convention grounds because they were way out in the countryside and there was so much less city light to obscure the night sky. "Wow, it's so beautiful," I said. "I'm looking at the most beautiful star," said one of the boys who was with us. "Where?" I exclaimed excitedly, only to be met with silence. I looked at him with expectation, only to find he was looking at me. The young me did not know how to deal with this. I didn't quite know how to feel. I think the main feeling was embarrassment. I also knew that my friends liked this boy. I laughed it off awkwardly and we all carried on walking. My 2 female friends seemed offended by this comment and walked up ahead. So I hung back on my own, feeling put off. This was when I felt a hand grabbing my butt. I was not expecting this at all. I knew it felt uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do. My female friends were offended, and the only other people were the 2 boys who'd come along with us. The other boy who was with him was also my good friend, and he didn't say anything, so I figured it must not be a big deal. I asked them to walk in front of me so I could go at the back. I know this might sound like only a small violation to those of you listening, but this perhaps seemingly insignificant assault has had lifelong consequences. In that moment, I felt like my whole world changed. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. I felt like I must have done something wrong because I was feeling so wrong. I remember feeling like I was dirty and spoiled. I felt invaded, and I also blamed myself. I couldn't talk to my friends because they were already annoyed at me, and young me thought they might blame me too. Deep down, I felt like the whole thing was my fault. I crept back to my tent, and I didn't even tell Mum about it. I didn't want her to view me differently, and I felt like I'd let her down. My young mind fully believed that it was all my fault and she had raised me to do better than that. To this day, I still can't handle men standing behind me. I even struggle to feel comfortable with partners being behind me, all because of that one time when I was a young teenager. Years later, the other boy who was there actually apologized to me for not doing or saying anything at the time. I don't blame him, he was young too. None of us knew what we were doing. How could we? Nobody taught us. Sometime later, we went on a group holiday to a place called Hatherley. There were quite a few families staying in this big place we'd hired out. Amongst those families was the family of this boy. During the course of the holiday, I was walking in a hall in the house and walked past the boy's father. To my horror, the father reached out and grabbed my butt and squeezed it. I was still a young teenager at this time. I went straight to my mum about this. Now, before I tell you her response, I want to preface this by saying I in no way blame her for how she reacted. I loved my mum and she loved me, and as a single mother, I believe she was doing the best she could based on her life experience and being raised in the cult. If anything, I blame the cult. Her response to me was simply, just stay away from him, and that was the end of the conversation. As an adult now, I think back on that, and I know that I would definitely approach that conversation differently if it was my child. However, Mum was in the cult herself, and she was a quiet and peacekeeping sort of person. I suppose she didn't quite know how to deal with confronting such a situation on a holiday that we were all part of. I can't ask her about it now since she's passed away, but I do know in hindsight that a conversation telling young me that this was not my fault and checking to see if I was okay and how I felt about the whole thing would have been immensely helpful and resulted in me carrying a lot less blame on myself. You see, that's not the only thing that happened on this holiday. Mum was of a different generation and was completely enculturated. I did avoid the boy's father for the rest of the holiday, which wasn't hard as we had a group of about 45 of us there. But the boy himself was harder to avoid. During that same holiday, I was heading back to my room after brushing my teeth, toothbrush in one hand and my jumper in my other hand. I ran into the boy and his brother. I don't remember the exact comments the boy made, but I remember his comments making me feel incredibly uncomfortable. I remember him taking my jumper and rubbing it in his crotch and handing it back to me. I remember going back to my room feeling, again, dirty and wrong and uncomfortable. One evening while we were staying there, a group of us went to a house of a family in the religion. We all piled in cars together, the boy in the same car as me. He put his hand on my leg, and again I felt uncomfortable. But again, to keep the peace like a good little girl, I didn't say anything. Once at the destination, he asked me, in front of everyone else, if I would play pool with him. I didn't want to look rude and say no, so off we went to another room of the house to play pool. I have written in my diary from that time that I constantly felt nervous that he would grab my backside like he did that time at convention. This made for a very uncomfortable game of pool for me. I would quickly shoot the shot and walk around the table to keep distance between myself and him. However, he kept coming closer and trying to grab me. I warded him off with my pool cue, which he then grabbed and pushed me onto the couch and sat over me. I could do anything I want right now, he told me. At that moment, we both heard someone coming, so he jumped off me and I sat up, disheveled and fixing my clothes. It was his brother. As soon as his brother walked in, I immediately walked out and went and sat with the adults for the rest of the evening. I didn't speak a word of this to anybody. I didn't tell Mum. After all, if she told me to stay away from the dad, I should have just stayed away from the son. I knew she wasn't going to do anything about it, and I felt that somehow, again, this was my own fault. And again, I felt like I wasn't in control of my own body. Again, I felt violated. And again, I felt helpless to do anything about it. As an adult and outside the religion, I have since experienced sexual assault, so I am aware that these instances of indecent assault from my youth may not seem like a huge deal. However, at a young age and in a cult where you don't know what to think and how to feel about it, these events have had a huge impact on how I viewed myself and my sexual autonomy. Nobody told me that what this boy and his father did was wrong. Nobody told me that my body was my own and nobody else was allowed to touch it unless I gave my permission. In fact, up until I was 30, I wasn't even aware that consent was mine to give. I've only just started learning about it and watching videos on it, and still it's been a struggle to wrap my head around. Sex education for me was non-existent. I know of some parents in the cult who wouldn't allow their children to attend sex ed classes at school because why would they need to know about that? When I got married, I was terrified about sex. I was scared it would hurt. I didn't even know how it worked. It was not until I met somebody recently who told me in depth about consent that I realized how little control and autonomy I felt over my own body. The cult told us females to cover up. We weren't allowed to show our shoulders, knees, stomachs. The more dedicated members followed this more strictly, while others didn't. The ones who didn't seemed to be cooler. I wasn't one of those. I felt that the way we dressed made us stand out, but not in a good way. I always felt insecure and inferior to everyone around me because I had to cover up so much. I don't know if anyone else remembers trying to run in a park or kick a ball while wearing a long denim skirt. I remember someone telling us younger people not to wear skirts with splits too high in them so as to not tempt the brother workers. That seemed strange to me. The workers were supposed to be chosen by God and people we could trust. Since leaving the cult, I have become aware of sexual assault and particularly child sexual assault being brought to light, with some of the perpetrators being male workers. Some of the preachers were people I knew. I suppose I was lucky because it was mostly just mum and we weren't allowed to have the brother workers stay at our house because it would appear wrong having two men stay over with a lady and her daughter. I left the cult 5 years ago, but I am only just beginning to understand consent and my autonomy over my body and my choice about what I do with it. I'm still learning to be proud of my body and that I can wear what makes me feel good without worrying about what other people think. I can wear a skirt or shorts above my knees and not be thought of as promiscuous. I can show my shoulders and not feel guilty about it. I can wear my hair down and not worry about who might see me. I'm still learning that I can dress in a way that makes me feel pretty and attractive and expect others not to take that as an invitation to do what they like with my body. I'm still learning that feeling safe and comfortable should be the standard and not something I have to fight for. The effect of having to cover my body for so much of my life has resulted in me being ashamed and embarrassed of it. I'm only just learning now to be proud of myself and my body, to not be afraid to show it off if I want to. I'm learning slowly that my body doesn't belong to God, to a cult, or to any other person. It is mine, and what I do with it is my choice. I'm still learning not to blame myself when others cross the boundaries of my consent, and that it isn't somehow my fault. I'm learning that consent is mine to give and withdraw at any time. It isn't something that is given once and then taken whenever. Consent is mine to give, or not give, every moment of every day. I'm still learning how to say no when I feel uncomfortable, something that I really struggle with to this day, even as an adult. In fact, I still struggle with saying no in general. I'm still learning how to start and build interactions with males without worrying about them maybe wanting sex and how I'm going to feel about it and how to say no. I'm still learning how to communicate in situations where I just freeze up because I feel so uncomfortable and traumatized. Most importantly, I'm learning to be more kind to myself and to respect and value my own boundaries. And I'm still learning what those boundaries are. And yes, I'm making mistakes along the way, but at least they're my mistakes to make. If you already know the laws, you can probably stop listening now, but I want to add this to the end of this episode in case there is someone like younger me, and even current me out there who happens to come across this. This is Australian law, but these are things I wish I had have known at a much younger age. And I would say they're things that are important for me to hear now. It is your right to never consent to sex if you don't want it. It is your right to consent to some sexual acts and not others. It's your right to consent to a sexual act and then change your mind. It's your right to consent to sex with someone and then not want sex with that same person at another time. It's also your right to refuse to have sex with your partner if you don't want it. Your body does not belong to them. Basically, you have the right to say no at any time and not feel guilty about it. Sex or making love is something that is yours to give, and never something that should be taken from you without your consent. Also, if you have been a victim of indecent assault or sexual assault, it never was and never will be your fault in any way. If you're in any kind of position to teach any younger person that they have full autonomy over their body, about what consent means, what they can expect as the standard from other people, how to stand up for their rights, and how to respect the rights of others, please teach them. I feel that because of how women are raised in the cult and how we were taught not to make problems and not to stand up for ourselves, that experiences like mine are not uncommon. And I wonder how people like me coming out of the cult are navigating romantic relationships and setting healthy boundaries and allowing themselves to set healthy boundaries and respecting those boundaries. It's something I'm still learning. In some ways, it's still a struggle because even though I'm over 30, I feel like I'm still a teenager learning how the world works. And hopefully one day I'll get there. But it's a journey, and I'm just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you. If you'd like to reach out, ask any questions, vent, say whatever you need to say, even if that's getting annoyed about something I've said, email me at exculted@gmail.com. That's exculted@gmail.com. And always remember, you can walk your own way, speak your own truth, and live your own life. Bye!